What are your worst nightmare neighbor conflict stories? This is more of a funny story than a neighbor from heck, but in our apartment, we kept hearing massive bass, think like a rhythm game, starting at like 6 PM to sometimes going till 11 PM, and it sounded like it was localized right above our bedroom. Finally, one night I go up and bang on the door, but they don't answer. About an hour later, I hear moving around in the apartment above me, so I walk out, hoping to catch them either on the stairs or so I can knock on the door again. I go out, and he's walking down the stairs. When he sees me, he asks if I can turn down the bass so he can sleep. It was like the Spider-Man meme where they are pointing at each other. I told him I thought it was him this entire time. So after we realized it was neither of us, we walked together and found the noise coming from a building 2 buildings down, and it turned out the dude had a drum set in his closet and was rocking out every night. Since we talk to him, we can hear it, but he always stops around 8 PM now, so it could have been way worse if the guy was a dong. That's like, weirdly wholesome. There was an old guy behind named Louie. He was a cranky old fart and had fights with every neighbor. His house's lot was the last on the street, and the crossroad where I lived had 4 lots back to his side. So he had 6 lots adjacent to him and he fought with them all. When I first moved there I tried to get along. I had been warned. I planted a garden and he oversprayed weed killer over a lot of my plants, including several nice watermelon plants. He'd yell at me. He'd yell at my dog. My wife said he was saying obscene stuff to her. One day he called me a fat hillbilly without a pot to pee in. I called him a stupid old goomba. He was Italian, and he acted like I really hurt his feelings. This went on for years, and he was keeping neighbors agitated as well. Here's the good part. One day I was at a flea market type thing and I saw him in his little accessibility cart. I tried to stay away. Suddenly from behind me I heard him say, "Hey, aren't you the guy that lives behind me?" I said yeah, and he popped out hand to shake and said how you're doing, and we talked. He was friendly. He told me his wife had a stroke recently and invited me over. I wondering what was going on. That summer he saw me and came out to talk and we chatted. I mentioned I played guitar and he jumped and said go get it and I'll bring the wife to the kitchen and you can play for her. I was stunned. I was shy about playing, but I brought it over and they thought it was wonderful. One day he apologized for being cranky before. I apologized back. Louie and I were friends the next few years. He'd tell me stories of when he was a kid in the 1920s. Just became a good guy. None of neighbors forgave him, but I did. I assumed his doctor gave him Prozac or something. Anyway, he died on the 10th of September, 2001, the day before the infamy. He was a diabetic and took nitroglycerine for his heart. Neighbors said he committed suicide, but I knew another guy that couldn't get his nitro on time and died. I think he had a medical emergency and could not make the call. About a year before he died, he asked me that if something happened to him to check the door on his lawn shed and make sure it was locked. I checked it. It was locked. I've posted this before. A little backstory for context later. I live in a very spacious country subdivision. We are about 25 years younger than the average owners. Everyone has at least an acre. My husband and I personally built a large shed next to a detached bed garage. It took us about 3 weekends to do it. We also mow our lawn once a week. Our yard isn't meticulous but hardly neglected. We got a letter in the mail one day. It was typed on a typewriter and came from the Upper Smith neighbor group. Name changed. The letter read, when you first moved in, I wasn't sure if you had the class, finances or breeding to be in our illustrious neighborhood. I see that you finally built a place to hide all the junk you insist on keeping in your yard. Now if only you could do something about that hayfield you call a yard. The junk they were upset about was building materials for the shed that were delivered, used and cleaning up in 3 weeks. I was so mad and revenge was first on my mind for weeks. I couldn't figure out how to handle it to my satisfaction. I figured it out right before the 4th of July. I got 2 old toilets and put one on either side of my driveway, by the street. I planted red, white and blue flowers in the bowl and stuck in a couple of small American flags for flair. Then made a large sign that read, "Thank you Upper Smith neighbor group for your letter suggesting I take more pride in my yard." I kept them for a whole year, switching out the bold decorations for every holiday with the wackiest decorations I could find. Good. Let the hate flow through you. Our neighbor kept complaining that the plants by the shared fence in our garden were dragging it down and ruining the plants climbing on her side. You only had to glance at the fence to see that it was massively weighed down on her side. It was sort of a wire fence and it was stretched and bowed on her side so that it practically touched the ground. We had a few plants against the fence on our side but nothing like she did, and yet she kept insisting it must be our fault. When we moved out, we hired a couple of gardeners to just tidy the garden up a bit for the next tenants. We left them to it and went inside to pack. When we checked on them later we found that the neighbor had come in and told them to get rid of all of our plants by the fence, which technically belonged to the landlord, and instead of coming to check with us they just totally ripped out every flower bed along the fence on the say-so of some random stranger. And of course it made no dang difference to the fence whatsoever. As a gardener here, that hurt to read. I'm so sorry. My boyfriend and I had a next door neighbor around our age who we thought seemed alright. Laid back professional. Rented the house with his girlfriend. Smoked a ton of weed. Nothing really noteworthy. His girlfriend eventually left him and we watched the dude slowly lose his mind after that. After a series of episodes of his screaming arguments on the phone or when his ex would stop by, we eventually saw it peak when he took a hammer to his cabinets. Our bedroom window had a direct view of his balcony and kitchen window. I was falling asleep when I started hearing a repetitive banging sound and looked out the window to see his perfectly lit kitchen window. In the window was our neighbor just smashing the ever-loving frick out of his kitchen cabinets. I know the landlord just renovated, and those cabinets were brand new. He was demolishing his freaking kitchen while screaming and laughing, and we could see everything from the comfort of our own bed. He wasn't able to see us, and I remember being frozen while witnessing this man just unhinge from reality like that. I grabbed my boyfriend as a witness to the event and the neighbor eventually calmed down and left the kitchen from our view. I don't think I slept much that night. The property manager saw us outside a few weeks later and told us that he moved. Then she told me she thinks the rental is cursed because it's broken up the last 3 couples she moved in. At the time, we were living in a new construction neighborhood, one of the nicest in town. Our next door neighbor was an older lady who lived alone and generally kept to herself. I was very surprised when she knocked on our front door one day and asked if I would walk outside with her. She led me to her backyard and across to the property line for the next house. A family with 2 young kids had moved in there a few months prior. I knew they had kids because the 2 were always outside, even though it was winter. My neighbor lady asked me if I smelled anything. I did but couldn't identify it. They're cooking in that house, she said. I wanted you to verify the smell so I know I'm not imagining it. She had owned rental houses and had encountered the smell from when tenants ruined one by making M there. I'm worried about those kids. You go on home now. I'm going inside to call the police. Cops arrived soon after. The parents were arrested immediately. The dad screamed menace swear words towards the older lady's house as 2 officers forced him across the yard and into one of their cars. The mom just kept screaming my babies as she was taken to a different police car. I couldn't see the kids, but I could hear them screaming and crying. DCS came and took the kids away. They were the first to live in that new house. It had to be completely gutted and redone inside because of the chemicals. That process took nearly a year. Neighbor lady surely heard everything that man yelled, and she probably risked retaliation if he got out on bail. He didn't, but she absolutely saved those 2 kids. I thought this was gonna be a case of quiet neighbor lady is a massive bee and wants to scold you for some tiny thing, but it was so much worse than that. Glad she was around and got the kids out of there. I don't remember this well, as this was handled by my parents. Ever since we arrived to the building we're currently living in, the water bill, I don't know if that's how it's called, had been insanely high. After years trying to cut showers and stuff like that, they finally called the water company. Turns out the laundromat downstairs, which was owned by another neighbor, had tweaked its pipes so that all the water they used was marked as used by us, not any business, a laundromat. Eventually it was fixed and we're back to paying a reasonable amount, but I don't remember if we were ever compensated for all the previous years. My dad, who was fighting that, died around the same time. Not related lol. He had cancer. I was told that the apartment across from me had kids but only on every other weekend. So that was a f-king lie. They had their kids there every day. all day, and all these kids did was scream 24/7. The parents would also scream back to them, with the TV permanently set to 90 on the volume. No kids show either. It's 1-bedroom apartments and they had like 5 kids, including a toddler. Oh, how did I know? Their kids tried to get into my apartment twice. They eventually skipped out and I got to see the stuff the cleaners had to haul away. There was an adult bed, a crib, and nothing else. These kids were sleeping on hardwood floors every night. When I looked into the bedroom, there was a kid-size hole in the wall, like someone had picked up and threw a child into the wall. Now I understand why the kids cried all the time. That's so incredibly sad. Those poor kids. I was the admin of the community Facebook page for a nice gated community and I really tried to be a good fair admin. I kicked a member off for calling all the women of the neighborhood useless CTS and saying that all housewives should be muzzled and chained to the stoves where they belonged. So he showed up at my house threatening to burn it down with our dogs inside. We were scared to leave our house for a while. I'd have called the cops if he threatened arson and murder. We had a neighbor who was obviously nuts. They were older and both unemployed and having a rough go of it. So what's an unstable busybody to do? Why? Peek over your neighbor's 6-foot-tall solid wood fence to spy. They called animal control on us because the dog's splashy pool water was gross. Not their drinking water. That was an automatic watering system that refilled with fresh water every time they used it. But the splashy baby pool water the dogs like to play in. We asked them, why the frick did you call animal control on us? Our dogs have their own floor of the house. They are hardly abused, they said, hysterically sobbing. We just didn't know what to do. We relocated to another residence after that. They then stole the huge ceramic pots of black bamboo that went on either side of the porch. When we pointed the theft out, they got angry and claimed since we were moving out, they were fair game. This was about 12 years ago. Had a married couple who lived above me. For the most part, they were quiet. One night they got into a fight, a huge fight. There was a bunch of noise, yelling, stomping, doors slamming. She managed to throw him out. He does a Ric Flair who and smashes their bedroom window to break back into their apartment. That is when 911 was called. I was the 5th person to call on that apartment. Spoke to the apartment office about that couple. They weren't being evicted. Their lease was almost up and the apartment office declined their renewal. Was the woo before, after, or during jumping through the window? Not so much a neighbor but a roommate in my dorm. First semester of my sophomore year, me and a guy named Alex became friends. He was a junior and I was obviously a sophomore, and we both were living in a mostly freshman dorm. I had a super crappy roommate who would often steal and throw away my things and claim it wasn't him or that it accidentally got thrown away, or would do other random crap vandalizing my stuff. But the hall director just claimed it was minor things and wouldn't take action. But at the semester break, Alex's roommate dropped out of school, and we asked the hall director if I could move into Alex's room. He agreed and I moved in for the start of second semester. However, things got off to a very rocky start. Alex apparently went to bed at 7:30 almost every night. He also could not sleep through a single peep. Despite there being no AC, he demanded the window stay shut because the ambient noise from outside was too loud. He also complained that my computer fan was too loud or that me typing on my keyboard was too loud and demanded both stop after 7:30. I would often go to the dorm room next to ours to hang out to not wake him up, but he claimed our voices carried too much and would tell us to be quiet. So needless to say, things didn't go well. Suddenly at the end of April, only like 3 weeks into February, my grandmother had a stroke and eventually died. I had to fly out of town for the funeral and miss a week of school. Apparently Alex took this as a prime opportunity and he called me to tell me I was moving out. But he also waited until the funeral started to call, and left a voicemail knowing both I wouldn't answer and that I couldn't call back for a few hours at the soonest. The call said that he decided to move my stuff into the hallway and I should come get it if I didn't want it stolen. My friends on the floor grabbed my stuff and put it in their rooms to keep safe, but I'm sure some things went missing. I was obviously in no way able to get home that day, nor was I really in the mood to talk to him on the phone about it. However, obviously what he did was both not allowed to the dorm rules but also was illegal, and he ended up getting kicked out of the dorm and I ended up having the room to myself for the rest of the year. What an butthole. Karma caught up to him fast, lol. My friend's new neighbor asked them to stop cooking food because the smell bothered them, but only in the guest bathroom. When she cozied up to the air vent, she suggested that instead of hot, cooked food, my friend should eat lunch meat and nuts. Or should they heat food the natural way? She did not give any specifics on what that meant. Later in the message she said that if they must cook food, they should consider simply not cooking food instead. Eventually she went to the leasing office to complain that my friends were cooking their food. Thankfully they declined the complaint because it was so ridiculous. If you're this kind of person, please never live in an apartment complex. Our first house was in a working class, post-World War II suburban neighborhood. The houses were a single driveway's width plus about 2-3 feet apart, open yards. We moved in early spring, with our then 2-year-old, so we were spending time outside when our new neighbors in their 70s came home. We smiled, waved. They came over to introduce themselves, and the first thing the lady says is, "I have something to say to you people. Don't blow the snow up against our house. If get water in our basement we will sue the crap out of you." Ooh, okay. Nice to meet you too. This was the beginning of the most ridiculous neighbor relationship I think I've ever had. I nannied another little boy, and she would come knock on our door and tell me to shut those dang kids up before I call CPS on you. They were running around my house, that I owned, or the yard, being happy, loud kids. Eventually I had enough and I ended up calling the non-emergency line for harassment. Then things got really weird. She would wake up at like 7 AM and bang on all the windows that faced our house. She'd open them and bang them shut repeatedly. She would pound her fists on them. Then about 7:38, she would walk out to her car after slamming the door and shake her keys as loud as she could. She'd throw them on the ground, pick them up and shake them, throw them down again. Then she'd leave for the morning. She would also randomly come wandering over, trying to give me $1 for my son's birthday, or tearful and wanting to come into our house. I wonder if she wasn't entering into some form of dementia. They sold their house about a year after we moved in. Growing up, the neighbor on one side would shoot the stray barn cats for fun. Broke my heart to find that one out. The other side was a cornfield for years, owned by a guy out of state that paid local farmers to plant and harvest. Then that property got sold and was bought by a family that ran a landscaping business. They would burn green branches, a lot, but only when the wind was blowing directly towards our house. We kept track. We lived in the country, but although our properties were quite long, they weren't particularly wide, so their house was relatively close to ours, and a ton of smoke would come in all the time. My dad started having serious respiratory problems due to all of the smoke, and the dad business owner would just ignore us or say he didn't care when we asked nicely for him to stop. Finally, my parents went to a lawyer and got a letter that basically said, "You've got to stop or we'll sue you for medical bills." My mom went to deliver the letter, and it just so happened that the guy's father-in-law was there too. He asked my mom what this was all about, and my mom told him. Phil ripped the neighbor a new butthole right then and there, apologized on his dopey Sil's behalf, and with a very stern look at our neighbor, assured us it would never happen again. And it actually didn't happen again. And my dad recovered once he wasn't breathing smoke in all the time. My parents and that neighbor both still live there. They are friendly with him now. But I just can't forgive being that blasé about making my dad seriously ill. Nice happy ending. I was fairly young, maybe around 4 or 5. I remember my parents always talking to our direct neighbors about people a few houses down. I didn't really understand it then, but they mentioned things like illegal, dangerous, etc. But it mostly went over my head. Then one time most of people on my block came over to discuss these dangerous neighbors. I don't think anything came of it because I don't think the police were ever called. I remember those people a few houses down were a little crazy and definitely scared me. My parents wouldn't let me and my siblings play in the front yard unsupervised. The whole cul-de-sac had issues with this one house. They would have parties every now and then that would get out of hand and was a huge noise issue. I remember not being able to sleep because the music was so loud. Then one day I came home from school and there were fire trucks and police cars on the street. and that one house was on fire. Since I was only 5, my parents didn't tell me everything and just told me there was a fire and the people who lived there had to move. It wasn't until years later I found out that the people who lived there were some type of drug dealers, and that fire, their lab straight up exploded and almost burnt the house down. The people were arrested and were never seen again. There was an apartment building in my town that was notorious for catching on fire. I later learned the building had been owned by a child molester and that it was labs that had been exploding. Oh, and the owner's sex offender buddy who managed the building murdered one of the tenants. Growing up, we had a neighbor named Ada. She was a widow and had a big dog. I think it was a Saint Bernard. We were told when we moved in that her dog was mean and had attacked some kids. Her backyard was fenced with a wooden fence and the dog was kept in a chain link pen inside that fence when it wasn't in the house. Our houses were separated by an alley and our yard was sunken a bit and had a stone wall on the outside perimeter. We would often play in our yard and that would make the dog bark. We never did anything to irritate that dog on purpose. We were terrified of it. If we were outside playing, she would yell at us about making the dog bark. One day my mom and I were at the mall. My dad and brother were home on our porch. Ada was walking the dog from her back door to the pen in the yard. The dog got loose, ran across the alley, across our driveway, jumped on my brother's back, he was 5 years old, and attacked him. All heck broke loose. Thankfully my dad was able to intervene before things got bad and my brother didn't even end up at the hospital. However, my dad lost it a bit. He was sure the dog would get loose again, so he brought his gun down from upstairs and made it more easily accessible. A few days later, the dog got loose again and he went out and threatened to shoot the dog. A few days later, my parents got served. They had to go before the magistrate. They needed a lawyer for this and at the time dad was either on strike or laid off, so money was tight. My dad's bill agreed to be their lawyer and they rounded up a few neighbors that the dog had attacked through the years. They went to court twice and the neighbor didn't show up either time. After that, the case was dropped. Eventually the dog died, and she didn't get another. But we never had any real contact with Ada until years later when one of their trees, a huge old pine, was blown over by the wind. It blocked the road and ended up in her driveway. Her garage was a separate building behind her house, just missing her garage. They actually dealt with each other cordially then. Fun times. People don't understand that keeping a working breed chained is going to result into something like this. New neighbor moved in downstairs from me. He and his large group of friends used to sit on the stairs outside of the building leading up to the door and smoke cigarettes and leave the butts all over the ground. They would also prop open the door even though we have a keypad to enter the building that's there for all of our safety. He also likes to stand in the hallway at 7 or 8 in the morning and just blast his music. It can be heard on all 3 floors of the building, but he's been doing it less since a lot of us complained to the landlord. His dog is poorly trained and I once heard him yell at his dog and threatening to beat it. He constantly blasts music in his apartment and plays drums and attempts to sing screamo, and again this is all heard through the entire building and starts as early as 8 AM and sometimes starts as late as 10 PM. My classmate lives downstairs next to him and once came out of her apartment and saw him sitting near her door in the hallway using an outlet, and he told her his electricity got turned off and he needed to go to the bank and tried to bum a ride off her even though they've never spoken before. One morning, around 10 AM, he was blasting a Nickelback song on repeat and one of my elderly neighbors knocked on his door and asked him to turn it down. He told my elderly neighbor to frick off and slammed the door in his face. A few days ago, I was walking into my building and his girlfriend, friend, sex partner, whatever was in the hallway, talking loudly on the phone and said, "You're lucky someone just walked in or I was going to say what I'd do to you. Just know I eat pee better than you." I just went up to my apartment and could still hear her conversation. My building had a lot of college students doing classwork online and families with young kids, so we're all having a hard time with this new guy. If management gets enough complaints about him and they're worth what the building pays, then they'll sort him out at the longest once his lease runs out. Otherwise, call in noise complaints to the non-emergency line whenever he starts that banging after 10 PM. Most places have a standing policy that quiet time starts around then. My neighbor rented his rooms to randos, and once in the middle of the day we say one of the renters in the front yard and washing his naked butt with a garden hose. My husband and him made direct eye contact while we drove by. He did what Reddit loves to do, assert dominance. My sister was looking to buy a 3-bedroom house and she was not having a lot of luck finding something livable that she could afford. She came across a house that was absolutely beautiful. Large airy rooms, big eat-in kitchen, everything updated and decent property size. It had been on the market forever and it was cheap. She was completely mystified until she was shown the property by the owner. Out comes the crazy neighbor, screaming at my sister, swearing, shaking her fist and hollering like a fat granny clampet. She followed them around the property screaming, and when they went inside she stood by the windows and screamed through the screens. The owner basically said, "No way in heck you are going to buy this house, right?" Nope. But my sister did sign a complaint and act as a witness for the homeowner. Never been so off at a story here. That lady deserves serious jail time or at least eviction from her property. We lived in a townhouse condo and across the parking lot was a building of apartment style condos. The townhouse has got 2 reserved parking spots and the apartment's got 1. Butthole neighbor from the condo building has a personal car and a work van and always stole spots until called out on it. It came to a head for me when it snowed like 2.5 feet on a weekday. I worked from home, so I shoveled my spots out throughout the day so it wasn't some huge task. When my wife came home, she came inside all mad because parking lot douche parked in her reserve spot and we couldn't have him towed because of the snow. I walked over and banged on his door to move and he just shrugged and said, "I don't have a shovel and it's the only spot open and I'll be gone for work in the morning before you can have me towed," and slammed the door. I was pissed. So I had to shovel out a visitor spot next to the spot he stole. The lot was 2 reserved, 1 visitor in sequence, so there were plenty of spots for him. And decided that the best place for all that snow was under, around and on top of his old butt rear wheel drive work van. I may have even poured a bucket or 2 of water under and on top of it to ice it all over. After I'm 80% done, his wife comes home and sees what I'm doing and runs in to tell him, and he comes running out like he's gonna start something. But I'm 6'5" and 275 pounds and both really pee off and holding a metal snow shovel. So seeing that I'm not gonna do crap to help him, he calls the cops. The cops show up and I tell them exactly the sequence of events above and fully admit to being an butthole, and that I hope he learns his lesson. The cops basically tell him rough crap. I haven't damaged his car or threatened him or any other actionable thing and that he needs to dig himself out. While they were there I also took pictures of both of my vehicles and the cops basically told the guy that if they had to come back, he was gonna be the one in trouble. So things got bad after that, and I'm sure I'm his story he tells for an butthole neighbor as well, and we're probably both right. But I gotta say, watching him dig out 2.5 feet of snow packed under his car with his literal hands while I sat on the porch and sipped a beer and waved with my snow shovels was very karmically rewarding. Also, we moved from there like 8 months later, so we didn't have to deal with him much longer. This is more funny than horrific, but it sucked in the moment. My old flatmate would frequently bring home girls, and this one girl he brought home was particularly vocal. Think of anything and everything you'd expect to hear a P-star say, and she screamed it, like everything. The next night he was out, but our neighbors had hatched a plan to get back at us. They proceeded to imitate everything they had heard the night before, but even more dramatized. But who was ultimately punished? Me. This went on for a couple weeks until he stopped seeing her, but I swear to God he was never home when the neighbors were retaliating. SMH. Maybe your flatmate and his girlfriend just went next door. Our neighbors had 6 kids under the age of 5, all boys, and they were all loud little shoots. Mum would leave them outside to play by themselves, and when they weren't beating each other up and screaming, they were pushing their slide up against our 6-foot fence and throwing rocks at our dog or jumping down into our yard to chase her. Once their 2-year-old climbed into our dog door and gave me a heart attack. Picture the girl from The Ring, only a red-headed toddler. Another time, someone was suddenly banging on my back door. I went to open it and a naked, soaking wet 3-year-old ran past me screaming into my house, out the front door and straight towards the pond across the street. Their mother yelled at me to mind my own business when I returned him to her. They cloth diapered, used the family cloth and made their own hippie detergent so when they ran their dryer, it smelled awful. One kid broke his arm badly and she posted on Facebook asking for advice on which was better and waited 5 hours to take him to the ER while he screamed in the backyard. Oh, and she gave birth to 3 of them, one kid and then twins a year later, in her master bedroom with all the windows open. They were renters and we once saw the 4-year-old hitting the 6-year-old with what looked like a stair banister. I felt so bad for the people who owned the home. Also, we moved away. That is a really sad situation for those kids. But I so want to imagine that mom was a mommy blogger who posts serene photos of cloth diapers neatly folded, and how home births are so much more holistic. I had a neighbor with a work truck, custom truck, and a custom car. He had so many vehicles that it was hard to park. When our second son was born, a 4th truck appeared. He rebuilt the thing. His yard was full of body panels instead of grass that summer. He was always using a metal grinder. He rebuilt the engine and took months to tune it. He'd back it up to as close to our house as he could and would rev the engine. Before work, after work and all day on the weekends. It was impossible to have conversations in our house. He would stop if we left. He would start things like this, create conflict and would act like the victim. Eyewitness: he yelled at cable installers, the landlord's brother who repainted the house. We were at odds because my cat went into his yard the summer before. So after pretending it wasn't getting to me, I called the cops, who blew it off and told him he couldn't do it after sundown. Sundown doesn't happen until 10 PM in Montana. I finally emailed a community resource officer and he shut that down. For the next 2 years the guy would film me doing something wrong. He had 6 cameras pointing out from his place to ours at all angles. If I was taking out the trash, he'd come out with his phone camera and try to catch me doing something. I dunno. Eventually his landlord evicted him. He still lives close and spent his summer evenings holding up a sign that said, "Screw your masks liberals at EUMB." I don't know what it means, but he wore a mask every time he went to the store. It is scary how many of those crazy people are out there. Growing up, a friend of my brother's lived next door to an elderly widow who became obsessed with a feud with that family. She was constantly calling the police on them. She claimed that they had dynamite hidden in the basement. Another time she soaked herself, clothing and all, in a shower, then came out after calling the police and claimed that the father had sprayed her with a garden hose. I'm sure I'm forgetting a whole pile of her antics. It was kind of sad though. She probably just wanted some attention. I lived next door to an Airbnb house. At first, it was fine, but then during tourist season the house was rented out to some dude that decided to invite all his boys over for a lovely party on a Tuesday till after midnight in the pool next to my bedroom window and blocked our driveway with their cars. We spent the next 6 months calling the police, non-emergent line, for one thing or another as a barrage of events unfolded. Other fun mentionables were loud pool parties till 2 or 3 in the morning, goth metal music blaring from a stereo that made our windows shake on that side of the house, garbage left sprawled on our yard, cars parked in our driveway when theirs was full. I eventually contacted the owners through the Airbnb listing and explained that if they couldn't find tenants that could respect the residential area that I would be happy to talk to the whore about putting in an ordinance against short-term rentals for our area. Needless to say, after 6 months of BS they put the house up for sale and we finally had a nice neighbor that moved in. Peace at last. Blocking and using your driveway. That is not even unintentionally. That's just being an butthole. I hope you called the tow company each time that happened. My neighborhood is fairly new, and the construction results in a vole problem in any new sodded yard. My next door neighbor has tried multiple methods to rid her yard of the voles, including spreading human hair, sprinkling vinegar, or maybe it was turmeric. Anyway, her latest vole removal effort involves lining her property line with used, bulging puppy pads as to deter the voles. We live in the northern United States. These pads are now frozen solid. The first layer is frozen to the ground and has a few inches of snow covering it. She just started the second layer. I have talked to her, and the neighbors on the other side and behind her have spoken to her about it. She refuses to stop because any other option will harm her dog and her 15-year-old son. All three of us have complained to the city and public health. When these things melt in the spring, it will be more disgusting than it is now. Tenfold. Two brothers moved in across from us in an apartment building. One was sketchy AF and kept trying to get me to let him in when my husband wasn't home. He would do weird things like had my husband call the cops because he claimed his brother stole our wedding presents. After that his brother kicked him out. Eventually we caught up with the brother and apologized for the whole thing. And he explained that his brother was into serious drugs and was causing him all kinds of problems. We felt bad but best to stay out of it. The guy seemed a little slow but otherwise okay, and with the drama over we all settled back into being neighbors. A month later he was arrested. He'd been tackling and raping women as they jog in the nearby park. Seriously derailed at the end. New apartment neighbor had a sound system on his shared wall with our bedroom and his living room. First night, he had a party, like friends, booze, weed, and strippers. Yay, strippers. Our bedroom wall was actually shaking. In total, I went over there about 6 times. Every time it was I have the base set to 0 so I DK what you're talking about. Had a 6-month correspondence chain with the property company to the point where the next step was eviction. He had a nice habit of getting drunk and passing out until 4-5 am with his music on. I tried all the how to deal with noisy neighbor suggestions, but there isn't a whole lot to block out bass. Thankfully I got into a grad program in another state and pieced the frick out within a month. Sleep deprivation seriously sucks. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video.